Has there been a really good lesson from something that didn't go to plan for you?
COVID threw a real spanner in the works for us, so we had decided that we wanted to move back to New Zealand. We were getting ready to exit the US. We had left our jobs, and then all of a sudden the first cases took off. We took our son out of school, our daughter out of daycare. Mid-March was when in New Zealand people started taking it very seriously, and they were talking about closing the borders, and they said, you know, New Zealand is overseas, you can come back and your partners can come back. It was a really big deal for us. My husband didn't have a visa. So he didn't have a visa. He was entitled to permanent residency because we'd been married for such a long time. So we had put in that application, but it hadn't been processed. So we were like, okay, they said you can come back. So what we'll do is I'll get on a plane with the kids. You pack up the house and we'll get a caretaker and we'll keys over to a real estate agent who can sell it without us here. And then you come over a couple of weeks later. We thought we'd just get the kids out. So we went home. We arrived 3 days before they went to level 4. And then the first thing they did in level 4 was say that they were not going to process visas for people who are overseas. So that meant that his permanent residency visa just got halted. So I was like, okay, well, they still said your partners can come. And then the next thing they said was, oh no, they had to be on the same plane as you. And so then we'd already been apart for 2 months. It was a period of real uncertainty, and I never had experienced anything like that because, again, with some privilege, you know, generally you look at problems in your life as things that you can figure out and overcome them, you know. This was the first time that I'd ever experienced that feeling of being completely helpless. You guys are number 4 for me.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
So you've done a bunch since we last spoke, because you did one when we last spoke.
I ended up doing 2 more.
So what are the podcasts typically about at the moment?
Oh, all sorts of things that I'm randomly interested in. One was in sort of pain reprocessing theory, and another one was in sort of coaching, but very sort of specific coaching, like business coaching and executive coaching for women. Those were really the topics for the other 3.
Nice.
Interesting though.
Yeah, very interesting.
Yeah.
Well, we thought you would be an amazing asset to have on the pod, given that you are well experienced in the financial industry. You have a great career both here and abroad, and you have some great views. So I thought it'd be wicked to have you on, and obviously you've been really helpful to us over the last couple of years. So we really appreciate that. So thank you, and great to have you on.
Awesome. Let's see how it goes.
So if you think about, I suppose, aiming for wealth, whatever that means to you, because it's obviously really unique to each person, did you have an event or a moment where you were like, okay, now I'm going to be a lot more conscious about planning my life to achieve that, whatever it may be to you?
Yeah, it was a long time ago. So it was probably 20 plus years ago when I was living in Sydney, and I'd been a lawyer for 8 or 9 years in private practice, and I was earning, by anyone's measure, a really good salary. And I added up the amount of money I earned compared to what I had, the amount of money I'd earned in my career, and the difference was huge. That was a really sort of a real wake up moment. Yeah.
So what was the next step after that then?
Well, I sort of floundered for a while, but it was at the same time that this movement in the States was starting called FIRE, Financial Independence, Retire Early. And the genesis of that was in a whole bunch of sort of personal finance blogs. So people were coming out of a tech bubble in the early 2000s. A lot of people had lost a lot of money, and there was this sort of everyone wasn't online like they are now. I was a little bit of an outlier, but I was reading a lot of blogs coming out of the States where people were like, oh no, we are going to implement extreme frugality and we're going to build extreme wealth. And that was really the genesis of where the FIRE movement came from. And so I started reading blogs, and I think the first thing I really did, and this is still the first thing I would tell anyone to do, is I just got a really good picture of where I was at. Right, and so you talk about it in all sorts of cases when you try and achieve anything. What you really want to start with is knowing your baseline really well. So I'd say establishing the baseline, like what have I got coming in, what are my outgoings, and what are my assets, or in my case, what are all my debts that I had. And so by that stage, I had a couple of great little credit cards and some student loan debt that was still ticking away. And just sort of sitting there and figuring out where I was at was the first step.
Yeah, it's what we're working on, with the product at the moment is thinking about your kind of the cash flow situation and then your personal balance sheet.
Right.
And I think the personal balance sheet is often overlooked. It's like, oh, budget. But budget for what, right? Like, you are very much like a company, or a company is like an organ, like a human, in a sense. And yeah, the personal balance sheet is such an important part of the picture.
Was thinking about it in exactly those terms, because I think on my sort of journey, initially wealth just meant a salary of anything, any kind of regular income. And then it was how high is my salary. But I never thought about how much of that was just going out the door all the time. And so being able to cover my cash flow, which I guess in my late 20s, early 30s, occasionally I was having, I was struggling to do that. Being able to cover my cash flow was fine for me for a long time until I hit that point where I was like, wait on, I should actually have some assets by now, and I don't.
Yeah, totally.
So how did you change your mindset around that? Because that's a big shift to make, to first kind of come across the idea, then see what you need to do, and then to put it into action.
I think I was in Australia, and Australia had compulsory super. So at the same time that I was sort of going through this learning phase, and I was working in wealth management. So I was working in, by this time I was working in superannuation and funds management in Australia. So I was sort of being exposed to a lot of the language of wealth building, although I'm not sure that I consider the way that people were doing it, the best way. So I was sort of exposed to a lot of that, and I was doing a lot of this reading about frugality and how you can sort of superpower your savings, or how you could snowball your way out of debt, or reading all this, and then starting to think about, well, hang on, it's not enough just to be spinning the wheels.
Yeah.
I actually want to be getting somewhere, and running your life on that cash flow basis means you're committing yourself to continue doing whatever you're doing to be able to achieve that same level of outgoing. And so the idea came through very strongly that at some point that if I wanted more flexibility or freedom, or if I wanted to be able to take a year off or do other things, that I was going to have to start thinking differently about money.
So what was that step then?
I mean, I think that's when I sort of did the math and said, I've earned this much in my life, and I have this much to show for it, and some handbags. And then figuring out, okay, now I'm starting from here, right? And I had some debt, and so my first priority was, okay, like, how quickly can I get that paid down and paid off? And then how fast can I watch my net worth? How can I make my net worth get to a level where I'm more comfortable, where I feel like I have some choices?
Okay. And so what are you doing at the moment then? So you've had a journey, a period of time. So what are the actions now?
Well, so now it's interesting. So now we're in sort of a privileged place where we do have a lot of flexibility with our lives. So my husband and I, we were living in the States. We came back in COVID. And we have a lot of flexibility in terms of the consulting work that we undertake, and when we, and taking breaks from that and how much we take on. We've got young kids. We had our kids later in life, so we have a lot of time to, we really prioritise having time to take them to swimming or to be at their soccer games or whatever they're doing. And we have sort of a roadmap for where we're going to be in the next 10, 20, 30 years. We sort of have flexibility and security, I would say.
And so did you sit down with your partner and kind of nut this out, or it's evolved over time, or like, was it a strategic's not the right word, but was it a conscious choice?
A lot of conscious choices. So I had really, I was really a big spender in my late 20s, early 30s, and that had really sort of stopped by the time I met him. I'd had 7 or 8 years of being like, oh no, I'm going to prioritise the ability to take a year off and go study overseas, or, take some time off and travel or do whatever. So I had already sort of internalised a lot of this. My husband is very frugal, right? So he is he was already where I needed to get to.
Okay.
And I would say actually there's still probably a gap between us, which is I think of as a healthy tension.
Yes.
But then I think coming out of the last 10 years and moving back to New Zealand, I think it has been quite strategic in terms of how are we thinking about, the assets that we have and how are we putting them to work in different ways. And we've made a lot of very specific choices. Well, I mean, I run a big spreadsheet. I love looking at numbers, so I have a spreadsheet that I update every month. Anyone who's moved from the US to New Zealand or has come back anywhere from overseas to New Zealand and has had to bring back, pension funds or 401ks or their Australian superannuation, there's a complexity to that and a timing to that you have to keep track of a lot of moving parts. But more than that, I just like seeing where the numbers are and keeping on making sure, this is what it said last month and it still says that, right?
And it's going in the right direction.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So probably it's more, I more keep track of things at the sort of the granular level, and he is more involved in big decisions do we want to buy this house? Do we want to buy an investment property, or do we want to invest more in equities or in index funds?
Okay.
Yeah.
So you've mentioned you've got a young family. Mm-hmm. So how old are your kids, if you don't mind me asking?
11 and 7.
So how, with the industry that you've worked in over time and the knowledge that you've gained and how mindful you are around it, have you got any thoughts around how you're going to educate your kids around that kind of thing? Is it something you're practicing at the moment, or something that comes a little bit later, or?
I mean, I think generally with kids, our view is that you can't talk to them early enough about anything, right? So we don't talk numbers with them, but they get an allowance that is their age plus $1. They are allowed to spend a fraction of that on lollies every Saturday. And it has two things. One, they're very good at adding up and figuring out what's $3.
Yep.
But two, we don't have to, that's our deal with them, is that they get the sweets on Saturdays. We don't have to do it the rest of the week. Yep. So they're allowed to spend a little bit of that, and then the rest of it they can spend as they like. And it's kind of interesting to watch the difference between the two of them. My 11-year-old, cash burns a hole in his pocket. It's just let me go, let me buy this, and wants to borrow money. And my 7-year-old squirrels it away. Yeah. And is no, I wanted that unicorn jacket, so I need 3 more weeks and I can buy the unicorn jacket. And actually she's bought, the last 2 pieces of clothing she's bought herself.
Wow, that's awesome.
Yeah. So that's quite interesting. So they have, at 7 we let them open their own bank accounts, and they have a debit card or I think it's an F+ card. Yep. So that they can access their money and they can see it online. And we have a deal with the older one that however much his balance in his bank increased between 1 February and 31 December, we would double this year.
Is it working?
Yeah, no, it didn't. No, I mean, it's working for us.
Yeah.
Because we're not going to have to pay out very much. So we involve them a lot. We let them work with money. I think a lot of us grew up in the 80s with families who didn't talk about money a lot. And didn't talk about bills and how much things cost. And so we try and do that in a way that is not giving them too much information or anxiety.
Yeah. Very cool.
Yeah.
So if you're doing that with your kids, which is really, really cool, is there, with everything that you've learned along the way, is there any way for you to bring other people along, or bring them on the journey, or educate them around it? Is that something you've thought about?
It's hard when you're so opinionated, because I just get frustrated with some of the things. So when I'm talking to friends and family, very much, some people ask me what I think. You've worked in the industry, what do you think of this? I try not to jump in where people haven't asked for an opinion. Yeah.
Okay.
But generally, I guess we don't it's still not something that is discussed a lot. My friends are starting, with my friends, we're starting to talk about like how are people saving for retirement and thinking about retirement.
And you have a varied experience as well, because you lived in the US, Australia, and here, and obviously it's very, very different.
Yeah.
The approach to money and investing and building wealth is actually very different. The habits that people have on average are quite considerably different. And of course, especially Australia and New Zealand, two of the most expensive countries in the world to consume financial products. So how do you feel about those different behaviors, and do you see a path to New Zealand being able to, I guess, up the game in terms of wealth per capita? Because, you know, in the late 60s, I think New Zealand was third in the world per capita, and now it's off the list. So, like, is there a path? And where does it start, I guess?
I think that's a huge question. I think depending on where you are in the United States, there's different conversations going on about wealth, and it's a really privileged conversation to have in a world where, you know, people had affordable mortgages 2 years ago and now they're selling their houses, or a lot of people aren't on a living wage, and in the US those inequalities are much more exacerbated. So it's you know, first of all, in the States it's a certain proportion of people who you're talking to about the kind of saving, who are able to do the kind of saving and wealth building, and I think generally I have a huge bias against management fees, fund management fees, and I worked in the industry for a long time with great investment managers who were charging really high fees. And I also worked with a financial advisor in one of the big investment banks in Australia who put my superannuation to a highly leveraged product, my whole super fund, and with a high fee. So one, it was borrowing. Two, it was about 1.2% plus a performance fee. And then came 2008 and the market crashed. And so my Australian superannuation fund, if I hadn't been in that particular leveraged product, my Australian superannuation would have been about 3 times what it is, I think.
Wow.
Like it was like I had paid in half of what I'd paid in over the time I'd worked in Australia. And so probably that's colouring my view a little bit. So generally I think fees are the big thing that we can work on in New Zealand, and I still see people in some really high fee KiwiSavers and investment products. And I think one of the benefits of being in the US for me was the ability to access really high quality investments, passive funds for next to nothing, for like 10 basis points. Right, so I think that is a really significant difference. But I think there are people in New Zealand now who are really working hard to make those products accessible, or at least make products accessible to New Zealanders that are much better value, and have much lower fees.
Do you think the fees are justified if, like, you know, because you actually it sounds like your advisor in Australia, in the Australian example, did something quite, I guess, different, perhaps? Like, it was a little bit more aggressive, a little bit more unique, by the sounds of it. I don't know the situation.
Yeah.
But is your aversion to management fees around the amount of work being done, or just in general?
It's about the difference in outcome for the investor. So, there's a big following for passive funds, because people are saying, well, no one can predictably outperform the market. I'm not sure that's completely true. I think there are some people who routinely can outperform the market. So for performance is different. Paying for performance.
I think it's really hard to outperform the market if you are tracking the market. So I look at a lot of the holdings in a lot of funds, especially I look through a lot of the Kiwi ones, and I just see 497 names in a portfolio that looks pretty similar to the S&P 500, but like you say, there's a 1.5% management fee in some cases. So, you know, it's very hard to outperform if you're hugging a benchmark. And then if you're hugging a benchmark, let's just make it easier for everyone and
invest the benchmark.
Put it in the benchmark itself. Yeah.
So I think that's one thing. I think New Zealand I'm by no means a tax expert. I think I'm just sort of understanding the impact of fifth tax.
Yes, it's
on
pretty major.
Our portfolio.
Fifth tax,
Foreign investment fund tax.
Okay.
It's a massive drag, and
it basically puts a 1.2% fee on your overseas asset portfolio, right?
Which obviously over the last 20 years has still been beneficial versus New Zealand equities, but it means that the default has been in New Zealand probably just go to property, right? Which in a sense you go, oh well, you want domestic investments to be healthy and you wouldn't want capital fleeing, which is kind of why you can rationalize a fifth tax. But then if there isn't too much productive investment going on in New Zealand, then we're just the system is built in such a way where you're just then forced into property, which is highly unproductive in many cases, versus obviously the actual change in kind of society and kind of innovation and kind of from equities globally. So it seems like a pretty major drag, but also there's a feature we're working on to actually help with this, but there's not a very good understanding of how to optimize it as well, because there are things you can do with your fifth tax to optimize your obligation pretty healthily.
Great.
Which I've been looking at quite a lot recently, because it's a massive drag, and you want to at least benefit as best you can and know what decisions you could make during the year that are going to affect your outcome at the end of the year when you are paying tax. Because if you leave it until it's already happened, then you file your return, then it's already happened. There's no optimization to be done because you've run out of time.
Too late.
But if you always know your obligation, like you always knowing with your spreadsheet where you're at, it gives you the freedom to make some changes and do some things that could save you some serious dosh, especially once you're talking about $50,000 plus.
Yeah,
that's when it's getting into real money, right?
Right.
Obviously before 50k, there's no fifth tax. So yeah.
And it's interesting because are you seeing that? Do you see that come in as an artificial limit on what people will invest outside New Zealand?
I mean, I think it depends if. I think it's a bit of a problem. I actually think it should be addressed properly, and I think that it makes sense unless there's going to be more productivity and listings in New Zealand. I think it makes sense to make some sensible changes, because actually, what has the government provided me for taking my capital overseas when there's nothing happening here? You know, so other than forcing me into an asset class that I don't particularly agree with, especially at the prices in this specific jurisdiction. So I think it would be valuable to look at it seriously, because unless we're going to see more productivity, and I think the underlying issue for New Zealand is actually the level of productivity that's going into businesses. Unless there's some nice ways for me to basically apply my capital or time to productive assets, then I'm forced overseas. So I think it's a bit of a barrier, but you know, if you look at the way that equities have worked overseas, specifically the US, of course, you would have paid the fifth tax because the drag on the portfolio is nothing compared to no growth or very, very little.
And that's where we've gotten to. So that's where that's where my head is. So I'm really interested to see your thoughts on how to manage that and maybe optimize it.
I can show you the sheet we have, but we're actually building a feature around real-time reporting of that.
So I think that's some of the things, and I think you've just touched on everything else about New Zealand as the difference between New Zealand and the US. And I would say also that within that group of people who are privileged and do have an asset base or the means to grow their asset base and create their asset base, I think the level of education and comfort in talking about it in the States and California, where I was, is much higher. You still come come across people who, you know, and this happened to me a couple of times where I knew someone really well, and they said, hey, can you understand this stuff? Can you help me with this? And this person would have been earning a huge salary, huge bonuses, and it was just all sitting in a bank account. and you know, a bank account that paid 0.01% interest, and this would have been over 5 or 6 years. And so it was interesting to me to find people, to come across those people who really had they were like, I'm just head down, I'm just doing my work, and I assume that everything else is going to take care of itself.
And ironically, in New Zealand, there is no insurance for bank deposits anyway. So you're actually much better off in some cases having it in a brokerage account because you have insurance. So yeah, it's an interesting one. I think there's a lot of education that needs to happen, but access is so easy now. It is easy to access. Plenty of options, like
information options
and execution options too. But yeah, like we mentioned before, it's still the most expensive place on the planet to consume just financial products in general. And I think that actually stems from the banks basically, and everything spreads out from there. So, you know, it really kind of sits there because every area of the market, capital or financial products are more expensive. Insurance is more expensive. You know, the margin that you're kind of losing on large loans is obviously greater. Startup capital is much more expensive in New Zealand than it is in the US or Singapore or Australia or the UK. You know, just accessing capital at any level is more expensive, and it ultimately stems from the banking industry.
But I think we, as a culture, we're a little bit more risk averse too. And so, you know, having spent some time back here and talked to New Zealand founders, there is not a reluctance, but people are more apprehensive about raising capital. What does that mean? Giving up control of my business. There's a lower tendency. People here, if you talk to a bunch of founders in Palo Alto, they are talking about billion dollar businesses, or $1 trillion business, or a $20 billion business that they're going to build in the next 2 to 3 years. And part of that is the size that you get from being in a market that size. That's creates leverage. But I find here, you know, I think we've got room to think bigger in what we're doing with our businesses, and expand overseas more quickly. Get, you know, a market of 5 million people is a great test market. So
the final step.
Right. So you've got to. So I love working with people who have the energy to be like, and in 3 years we're going to be doing this, and in 5 years we're going to be doing this, and in 10 years we're going to be doing this, and they have really, really big visions.
And it doesn't actually, you don't have to go far to get a huge market. You can just literally fly a couple of hours and you're in Australia. And it is like, in the case of what we think about as an opportunity here versus Australia, and Australia is going to be our next jurisdiction that we're actually increasing the speed of which we're going to go to Australia because of that, is about 15 times bigger. Not just because of the population size, but because of also the user habits. And, you know, currently, obviously, New Zealand has slowed down a little bit more than Australia due to the kind of idiosyncratic nature of the two economies. But then you also think Southeast Asia, places like Malaysia, are really interesting. Vietnam, I think, quite digital native, growing middle class. But then it's about providing a product and having technology that actually can win elsewhere, rather than having kind of more of a brand that is just a brand locally and then can't really compete overseas. You have to have some sort of edge to compete overseas. And that typically, obviously in our game, comes in the form of a technical advantage of some description that isn't offered as a commodity, you know, overseas.
And then you're often talking about being incorporated into somebody else's product, right? Or being white labeled, or going under an established.
That would be terrible. I wouldn't want to do that.
Right. But I think that is the way that happens.
Yes.
I think that is what happens with a lot of New Zealand businesses,
Right.
where you go, and I'm not even just thinking fintechs, but other startups that have gone offshore, and then they've found that the way for them to get the leverage or get the customers base or get the exposure is to be under the umbrella of somebody else's brand.
And that can sometimes be a symptom of the cost of capital being so much higher, and you have already diluted yourself to a point where, for example, a US investor may no longer be interested because there are too many investors on your cap table that are taking up too much of the cap table. So that again comes back to that cost of capital thing, and founders in New Zealand have to be so strategic with capital raises because of that, the nature of having quite a high cost of capital. And many people go, well, then you should just go overseas as soon as possible, which is a valid strategy. But I think it's also high risk, because trying to go overseas and then actually stand out enough to get that external capital from overseas initially it feels like a bit of a leap of faith. And both work. I think it's just in the early stages, founders just need to know that, like, you're giving up a part of yourself every time you raise $1, and you just happen to have to give up more of yourself here than overseas. So
for what you get.
And you should just be strategic about that.
Yeah. I can't answer that. I think you're exactly right.
So it'll be interesting to see if it becomes, because ultimately it comes down to then, I guess, competition. So how does New Zealand, how do you think it will become more competitive? How can it become more competitive to actually make it cheaper?
I had a great belief in the power of the internet. Again, 25 years ago, I thought the internet was going to do that. And I think it has, to a large extent. I think the internet, the products that we can access, it took longer than I thought it was going to take. The products that we can access now, because of the power of online businesses, are insanely different from what they would be if we didn't have that channel, right? How can New Zealand? It's hard. It's a hard problem. Having been back here for a few years, the distance, when you're talking about anything in the real economy, the distance is hard, right? And I think that does show up throughout the economy. My family and I were planning a trip now, and it's interesting how differently you think about taking a trip to Europe from here than you do from the States.
Yeah.
If you think in terms of your escape velocity is so much higher. So I think New Zealand has to be we can't just be competitive. We have to be ultra competitive. We have to go so far in the direction of increased productivity to get to where we were in today's economy. I don't really know. I think my tiny part of this can be using my knowledge and experience and working with founders who need to cross certain regulatory thresholds or compliance thresholds or product-led, sort of product-centric thresholds that they need to do to get overseas. I don't have any. I don't know what I would say.
Yeah, that's great. I think you said some stuff.
Yeah. So obviously not everything goes to plan. Has there been a really good lesson from something that didn't go to plan for you?
The same thing that didn't go to plan for 6 billion other people. Right. So COVID was threw a real spanner in the works for us. So we had decided that we wanted to move back to New Zealand, and we were getting ready to exit the US. We had left our jobs, which meant we were paying out of pocket for health insurance, which is a high cost, it's like a mortgage. And so we were getting ready to pack up, exit the US. We were going to go travel for 8 or 9 months in 2020, and then come back to New Zealand in 2021 and start setting up our life here. And that was, we liked. I really loved living where we lived, and I had the most amazing work opportunities. But we didn't see our kids very much. The last job I had, I was sometimes only seeing my daughter 2 or 3 times a week. She was only 2. I had really long commutes, and the culture around things like taking leave or not working weekends or not travelling every time, you not travelling to meetings every 2 weeks just because you could. I think that was getting harder for us to sort of live with. And so COVID, it was March. We'd sort of seen, everyone was watching the news, And I think if you work in any kind of quantitative area, you were watching those very early numbers, and even though the empirical numbers were low, the rate of increase was really troubling in January and February. And so we'd started thinking that we were going to have to not travel. And were we going to, if it got to pandemic level, were we going to hunker down in California, or were we going to come back to New Zealand? We were having those discussions, and then all of a sudden we were in Santa Clara County, which was where the first cases took off in the States, first hospitalisation, I think first death. And we were seeing those numbers go up, and we were sitting there at the beginning of March going, why aren't they closing schools? And then finally we took our son out of school, our daughter out of daycare, and we said we're going to stay home for a while. And at that point we were still like painting the house, getting it ready for sale. We were still sort of operating on two parallel tracks. We also bought a deep freeze and filled it up with 3 months worth of food, which we worked out on our spreadsheet, what we would eat in 3 months, and we sort of filled that up. And then we sort of got to mid-March, and mid-March was when in New Zealand people started taking it very seriously, and they were talking about closing the borders, and they said, New Zealand is overseas, you can come back and your partners can come back. It was a really big deal for us. My husband didn't have a visa. This is a very long story, sorry, but it really did throw us for a loop. And so we thought, okay, so he didn't have a visa. He was entitled to permanent residency because we'd been married for such a long time. So we had put in that application, but it hadn't been processed. So we were like, okay, they said you can come back. So what we'll do is I'll get on a plane with the kids. You pack up the house and we'll get a caretaker and we'll hand the keys over to a real estate agent who can sell it without us here. And then you come over a couple of weeks later. We thought we'd just get the kids out and me out. So we went home. We arrived 3 days before they went to level 4. And then the first thing they did in level 4 was, the first thing they did that really impacted us was say that they were not going to process visas for people who are overseas.
Wow.
So that meant that his permanent residency visa just got halted. So I was like, okay, well, they still said your partners can come. And then the next thing they said was, oh no, they had to be on the same plane as you.
Oh God.
So that was in, so we had late March, all of April, and then I think in early May was when they first said, no, your partners, if they were going to come, they had to be on the same plane with you. And so then we'd already been apart for 2 months, and then we were looking at this potential, what do we do? What happens now? So there wasn't MIQ, there wasn't anything like that, but it was a period of real uncertainty, and I never had experienced anything like that because, again, with some privilege, generally you look at problems in your life as things that you can figure out and overcome them, This was the first time that I'd ever experienced that feeling of being completely helpless. There was, we applied for numerous exemptions to immigration to try and get him a humanitarian visa to come in and be with his kids. And I think we must have made 10 or 12 applications, and some of them got rejected within 3 minutes of submitting them. Yeah. So it was the next sort of May, June, July, August were just this 3-month period of trying to guess what would happen. And it's not at all the same as the uncertainty that some people in the world are exposed to, but it's a little taste of that. We're subject to forces that we just can't control. Yeah. And on top of the fact that you're in a pandemic and you're in the house 24/7. And for me, I was parenting on my own, which I hadn't ever done before. In fact, I had probably escaped the majority of the work associated with parenting over while our kids were small. So in terms of what that did to us and how we think about that now, factoring it into the future, probably I put a much greater premium on resilience and defensiveness. And so when I talked to you about the advisor before and I said, he put me into this product, I chose to go into that product. Right. I knew what that product was. He was doing a fine job. He gave me options. And I have always been quite aggressive in terms of my investment profile. So I would say that COVID taught us to pull back. We have for all our estimates of what things are going to cost, or what our cost of living is going to be in 2 or 3 years, we probably have a 30 to 40% margin that we just layer onto that just to account for inflation or pandemics,
wars,
whatever, so I think I would still say that my investment profile is it's definitely not conservative, and it probably is still quite aggressive. But thinking in the short term, like the next 3 to 5 years, definitely we have some defensiveness built in there. Sorry, very long story.
No, not at all. Well, it's obviously everybody went through COVID and had different experiences,
Right.
and I think it's important to hear how you end up where you're at and the decisions that you make, right?
I think the other thing coming out of that as well is just what I found having to exit the States quickly and come over here is that tidying up everything financially over there has been astronomically more difficult than it would have been if I'd had 3 months to do it, like we'd planned. So if I'd been able to go places in person with my ID, so I think then there's all that practical side as well. So another thing that comes out of that is we tend not to let things linger anymore because, passports expire. We're on top of passports because we had an issue with a passport at one point during our saga, and so I think that that applies across the board.
Lessons learned.
And again, everybody,
So if there was somebody starting out on their wealth journey, is there any advice that you would give them? Any suggestions starting out?
I mean, I think that first thing that we talked about, which is what's your baseline. You can't really function without an understanding of what reality is in your situation, right? And so what's your baseline? Where are you now? Just get a really good understanding of your financial position and what else wealth means to you, right? Like, do you want to work 20 hours a day and then get to 50 and not be able to stand up? Right? So think in a multifaceted way about what wealth means, and then take your baseline in all those areas. I think that's the most important thing. And then measure what you're doing and see how things are changing over time, because it's nothing. And maybe I'm an outlier, but nothing gives me impetus like going, oh, look how far we've come.
Yeah, tracking, like I did this thing and we've got a resource. I created like a open source goal tracker that I called the 12-12-12, which is like 12 days, 12 weeks, 12 months, 12 years. And obviously I do the 12 weeks. I don't continue the 12 weeks throughout the year. I consider the first 12 weeks of a year like you can just get so much momentum for the year if you do a lot in the first 12 weeks. But obviously I look back, and I've done it maybe for 7 years now, and looking back at how much I've achieved in those 12 months is awesome.
Yeah.
So kind of being able to track things is great. Also, just like you say, for actually being able to see, oh no, actually I did that thing and I did that thing. Although things obviously do take longer than you expect always, and don't go like in a tidy way to where you want to go often. It's just good to know where you're kind of heading.
And I think I'm going to get the phrase wrong. There's a phrase, the hedonic treadmill. Am I using that right? Is that the right one? This is the phrase that they used to say that when you get a pay rise, you just get used to sitting at that new pay level, right? But if you treat yourself as if you never got the pay rise, then you're fine with where you were before. It sort of applies if you're goal oriented and you're always doing stuff. You're always trying to get to the next place. And I know that applies to you, and it applies to me. It's very easy to forget how much you've done in the past. And if someone said to me this, what have you achieved this year? I'd be like, it's June. I don't know. I feel like I've just been sitting around. But actually, if I go back and look, there's a lot of things. And being reminded, when I used to manage teams, actually, this was a issue for me with my teams. I'd be like, we have to keep going. And they're like, no, we have to stop and celebrate, right? We achieved a lot of stuff. So I think sitting there and making sure that you know what sort of you got under your belt in the past is really, it's really motivating.
Totally. I agree. Awesome. Well, thank you for coming on, Erin. I really appreciate it.
No worries. It was
I
fun.
think this was a good convo, and I think that people will find it pretty valuable.
Yeah, different points of view. Really good.
I thought you were going to be perfect for the pod, so You're one of the
You were
first
right,
people I
Charlie.
thought of.
You were right.
Let's see how it works out. Thanks so much for having me.
No probs.
All right.